Chapter 6. Mental Imagery. To think is to be. That which is visualized in the mind becomes part of the possessor of that mind, because a man is what he thinks. It is strange how little we know about the mind. Not much more has been determined about it since the time of Descartes and his brilliant basic premise. Cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. We only know we exist because we think. Should thought stop in us, we automatically would cease to be. Should thought begin at any particular point in space, that point immediately would begin to live. It is deeply significant that we exist by grace of thought, and it is even more significant that at any particular time we are the sum total of the thoughts we hold in our mind. It seems reasonable to assume that the thinking being that inhabits us in thought itself, that the more complex and universal our thoughts are, the more complex and universal we become. It is impossible to separate the image in the mind of a beholder from the beholder himself, because, in a very real sense, the two are one. That which achieves the attention of consciousness becomes that consciousness. When our attention is focused on something, we become that thing. It is this power of consciousness that it becomes the thought it thinks, which gives the mind such ascendancy over matter. Because thought is invisible, it never has come under the scrutiny of the laboratory microscope. As a consequence, men are nearly as poorly informed about the qualities and processes of thought as they were at the dawn of written history. Even though it is recognized now that the thoughts a person thinks determine his whole life, the average man continues to think in response to sensual stimuli rather than in response to his inner wishes and desires. Mental law. The thought first, then the thing. That is the law. But the vast majority of people live on the opposite premise. The thing first, then the thought. The power of mental imagery still works even in this reversal of form, but in this case it merely lends validity in everything they see and every situation they encounter. Such people are unable to grow beyond the limitation of their own emotions, for they give credence to all sensual stimuli. Each such stimulus becomes bound up in an emotional reaction. Whenever they encounter an event or thing which they have encountered before, they react in a predetermined manner. It thus becomes impossible for them to progress into any degree of effective living, for, by the very nature of their mental position, the things of the world control them. They never control the things. They are either fearful or hostile, resentful, envious or sad. But each of these emotions is inspired by a stimulus from outside and never by inner convictions or desires. These are the people who are the most strenuous defenders of their mental aberrations. The most fortunate thing that can happen is that life reduces their egos to nothingness. To a great extent, their eyes are then cleared and they are able finally to see that they have always reacted rather than acted. When humility enters a man's soul, he is at last able to perceive that he does not live alone in the world, but with millions of brothers, and that hidden in the heart of each is the same animating spirit. Forecaster of the future. To know is nothing at all. To imagine is everything, wrote Anatole France. That which seizes the attention of our consciousness is an infallible forecaster of the future. Indeed, were we to know the thoughts that occupy a man's mind, we might provide him an accurate description of his coming life, down to the most intimate detail. There is in thought a motor impulse that compels us to do the things we think about, and this is a law far above moral or ethical considerations. It works just as quickly for what is considered evil as it does for what is considered good. If you keep thinking about robbing the corner service station, and you keep this image in your mind for several weeks, you one day will find yourself at the service station, gun in hand, prepared to empty the till. People who commit so-called crimes of passion often report they were in the grip of a compulsion they could neither control nor understand. Such compulsion proceeds out of their thoughts. Images projected into the moving screen of mind finally take root in the motor impulses of the body, and each person is propelled into the action he visualizes in the deeper recesses of his consciousness. The Dhammapada cautions us to guard our thoughts, and indeed we should. Everything that is admitted into our mind takes shape, form, and substance in our lives, and we can stop this from happening only by ceasing to live, for the law of life is the law of thoughts becoming things. Clear thinking. The quality of our mental imagery determines how quickly we get effects in the outer world. Since most people are relatively unaware of thinking at all, they give little consideration to how well they think, to the clarity and reality of the images they envisage. Most of us are fuzzy thinkers. When we call something to mind, it comes to us as a vague and shadowy presence. We do not really see it, feel it, hear it, touch it, penetrate it, take it unto us, but rather are dimly aware of it. By means of some verbal grasp of its idea, we say, "my house," but the image does not call to mind the actual house, only a vague idea of it in terms of whether the taxes have been paid, the outside walls painted, the lawns mowed, or a party given there Saturday night. We adopt meanings about everything in terms of personal significance, but we seldom conjure up images in our consciousness for the simple reason that we never have trained ourselves to think that way, never have truly understood the significance of such images. Think of something familiar. Think of a room in which you spend a great deal of time. See yourself sitting in some particular chair in that room. Look around. What do you see? Are there pictures on the walls? Where and what kind? What are their colours? Where are the furniture, books, papers? Is there dust gathered in the corners? Where are the lamps? How do they operate? See yourself in that room with such intensity that you actually feel that you are there. See the colour, the solidity of objects. Work on this for a few days. If you are lucky, you will have an experience that will startle you. During one of these meditation periods, while you are visiting this room in your mind, you will have the sudden feeling that you actually are there. When this experience comes to you, you will be there in a very real, though psychic sense. Such is the tremendous power of correct and clear mental visualization. A door ajar. There are other tests you can take to convince yourself how fuzzy your thinking has been and how much power lies in making it clear. If you are married, try suddenly to call to mind the face of your spouse. You may be shocked to realize how difficult this is. What you immediately call to mind is an idea of your spouse, and this idea has the wavering shape of a shadowy dream. Concentrate on making his or her face as clear in your mind as a photograph. Bend the entire effort of your attention toward this end. Gradually the picture will clear. Soon you will see that face before you, animated, alive, vibrant, so that you feel certain that if you reached out, you could touch a cheek with your fingertips. Don't be surprised that evening if your husband or wife says to you, "I was thinking about you all day today." This is not legend or superstition or wishful thinking. When we deal with the mind, we are dealing with the most significant thing in life. There are undreamed of powers in consciousness, and they have not even been tapped. The current awakening to telepathy, the clairvoyance, and precognition have barely jarred the door into an enormous storehouse of fantastic powers and perceptions. We take our first step on the proper path when we realize the original power of mind over matter and how our thoughts influence the world we live in. Once we truly have apprehended the tremendous force that propels a mental image to become a physical fact, then we see that we must dedicate our efforts to becoming clear and concise thinkers rather than rushers around in the world. Psychic imbalance. We must learn to visualize with complete clarity so that an image called up in the mind exists with the same solidity, color, and dimension as one in the physical world. Research conducted into the content of dreams has revealed that some people dream in black and white, while others dream in color. Others dream in pantomime, still others with full sound effects. Some people's dreams are populated with folks without faces, and in some people's dreams it is always night, in others it is always day. Such research has proved pretty well that emotional blocks in the subconscious restricts the individual from completely visualizing things in his mind. If it would finally involve a change of residence, for example, he might report that he is able to see the new home and everything in it, but is unable to visualize himself there. It is the subconscious that blocks him out from such visualization. Some fear or hostility or resentment has given him a deep mental block about moving and forbids the picture from entering his mind, and thereby bars the actual event from happening in the physical world. It is no easy matter for him to overcome this subconscious censoring of his thoughts. It represents a wrong self-identification, a psychic imbalance. This psychic imbalance is universally caused by the centering of consciousness in the ego rather than in the deeper regions of being. A man who allows his surface self to control his life is in the grip of a Lilliputian ghost. He eventually will become bound up mentally by thousands of little prompters that proceed out of his subconscious. It is they that give form and substance to his ego, the thing he regards as himself, which is never himself at all, but only the limitations that he has accepted and come to regard as real. Instinctive performance. The ego thinks from a small standpoint in the center. It thinks outward. It seeks to know by groping into the unknown, attempting to rationalize what it finds there. Since infinite space surrounds it, it is impossible for it ever to grow into great understanding. Since what it thinks is colored by what it already knows, and since what it knows is based upon a strictly personal and infinitesimal interpretation, it therefore, by its very nature, cannot ever arrive at true knowledge. Before a man can be truly wise, before he can arrive at his birthright of power and understanding, he must in some degree shuck off the trappings of the ego and take on a wider kind of consciousness. Instead of being a central thinker, He must learn to be a peripheral or outer thinker. He must learn to allow thought to develop in him under the impulsion of something outside of and greater than himself. He must learn to be able to do things without focusing his attention upon them. He must learn to perform them through an instinctive understanding of their true nature. The ego prevents a man from performing in this manner. To be self-conscious is to be fearful and restricted. The instinctive and natural performer thinks with his outer and wider mind. He who is enwrapped in consideration of his ego and sense of self is bound up in fear and tension during the simplest of tasks. That which we do well, we do not think about. We simply perform by grace of our outer and wider mind. When we lose our contact with this mind, we fall from grace with a bang. For all by ourselves, focused upon each little movement, we cannot perform the simplest of tasks. There seems to be absolutely no limit to the feats the human being can perform when he is able to grasp them with his outer or peripheral mind. A man stands on the forefinger of one hand atop a 100-foot pole. Another walks a tightrope across the chasm of Niagara Falls. Another springs from a board and turns 3 somersaults in the air before landing on his feet. How is it possible, we ask ourselves, for a human being to do such things? It is possible because the man has mastered the knack of performing without thought. He has learned to shut off the thinking of his central self and to stand outside, as it were, grasping his whole action as a continuous thing, seeing it as a single, flowing and broken movement. As a consequence, arms and legs move, muscles coordinate, energy is expanded, all at the behest of a complete picture held by his wider mind. He performs from the spine and thinkingly responds only to the image of what he wants to do, just as another man might walk down the street thinking only of where he wants to go and never of the act of putting one foot in front of the other. Trusting your greater self. The reason why most people play such atrocious golf is that they have broken the golf swing down into a dozen different small actions, each of which receives the focus of their attention when they stand up to hit the golf ball. It is a wonder they don't break their spines or snap a tendon. The miracle is that they hit the ball at all, since they are thinking about everything else but that. Those rare specimens who master the art of shooting par have mastered also the art of not thinking how. The great player stands up to the ball only after he has made up his mind where he wants to hit it. He doesn't think of how he will hit it. We can adopt this method in everything we do. We can stop thinking how to do things and start concentrating our attention only upon where we want to go. Once we have made a decision, we must learn to trust our greater outer mind for the actual performance. There is a deep underlying psychological reason for this. The brain and the organs of the body are not to be trusted beyond the intelligence from which they grew. To subject all performance to the limitation of human reason is to subject all action to restriction and error. An infinite and eternal intelligence grew the brain and body, and both now nestle in the lap of that intelligence, are products of it and never its master. We must stop forcing our ego to act as an originator of action and thought, and instead learn to let thought develop in us as a result of a complete reliance upon an outer and wider sense of being. Chuang-Tzu wrote, "A drunken man, when he falls out of a cart, though he may suffer, does not die. His bones are the same as other people's, but he meets the accident in a different way. His spirit is in a condition of security, he is not conscious of riding in the cart, neither is he conscious of falling out of it. Ideas of life, death, fear, etc. cannot penetrate his breast, and so he does not suffer from contact with objective existence. What we are driving at is an attempt to function through the totality of our psychic being rather than some small part of it like the brain or the reason or the memory. It should be obvious that the whole is always greater than its parts, and if we can learn to think and act through the totality of all psychic functioning, then it is apparent that our effectiveness must be vastly increased. The important thing to remember is that the center of the mind's activity is not in the conscious thinking process, but in something greatly above it, outside of it, and yet, in a manner, within. Active mind. When a man learns to let his mind alone, it begins to function in a spontaneous manner that is natural to it. It rids itself of inhibition and restriction, and the person's effectiveness and energy are greatly increased. There are large rewards to be gained from learning how to function unconsciously. It is through painful awareness of self that all imperfections spring. We are able to stifle the nagging voice of self-consciousness through immersing it in the great sea of being that is the secret self. There it merges and is lost as a drop of water merges and is lost in the ocean. We become natural men instead of artificial ones, and all our actions and all our thoughts take on a spontaneity that springs directly out of the divine. Unthinkable ingenuity and creative power lie within universal mind, and to the degree that you learn to trust your life and being to it, that much of its power is yours. The most remarkable thing about man is his mind. The mystery that surrounds another person is the fact that he thinks, that his thoughts are invisible and therefore strictly his own. Within the boundaries of his own being, he lives in a world that no one truly penetrates. It is populated by shapes and structures, events and persons known only to him, with the significance that it is rooted in symbol, and this world in his mind has greater meaning for him than the materialistic world in which he moves. He retires from the material world when he goes to bed, but even in sleep the world in his mind is still with him. This mental world has even greater meaning in sleep. Now his thoughts, though still couched in materialistic terms, take on symbolistic significance, and the things he dreams comes to him as disguised meanings, playing out upon the screen of consciousness the conflicts that exists in his subconscious. A man is with his mind 24 hours of every day, and he never ceases to think. He is influenced 1,000 times more by the thoughts that cross his consciousness than he ever is by the situations he encounters in the sensual world. He is truly a mental creature, and those animal qualities he possesses are residual only, left over from an evolution whose great thrust was its effort to produce mind. Just as consciousness has evolved out of matter to eventually control matter, so will it one day be free of matter, for the very nature of being presupposes a greater existence than any that is likely to occur as long as it is bound to the flesh. The cycle of birth, growth, decay, and death is bound to a physical world with its necessary constant production of different forms in an effort to find the most effective one. Such a cycle, however, no longer is mandatory for the mind, which has settled on an absolute form and no longer is changing in kind, only in degree. Evolution has brought us to the point where a mental being might best serve advancement by being free of the cycle of birth and death. Such a step is undoubtedly part of the evolutionary plan. It may be set for a time, somewhere in the future, or maybe upon us now. Meantime, the fact has become apparent that the pathway to man's salvation lies in emphasis on mental existence and gradual turning away from physical bondage. To think is to do. Up to now, no one has been able to stop the physical aging of the body, and currently every man is subject in the end to a physical death. As long as our activities, our pleasures, and our sensations are rooted in our physical bodies, we have no alternative but to eventually suffer pain, dissolution, and decay. But when we turn away from our physical bodies and take up residence in our minds, then we are able to experience a constant growth that lends us not only a deep personal satisfaction, but fulfills the fondest wishes of life and evolution. To once make up your mind that intellect is superior to and supersedes matter is to take the most important step of all in the living of a serene and effective life. The soul grows within, even as the body decays without, and that man who is able in the end to merge his sense of being with that of the secret self has perpetuated himself into eternity, has achieved immortality. Images that play about in our minds leads us inevitably into action. This is a law of life, and we can neither start nor stop it. Whatever we think about, we must do. Since we cannot stop our thinking, we inevitably are led into action by our thoughts, even if this action be of the most negative kind. Since a human being is a dynamic entity, choosing not to do a thing is just as much an action on his part as doing it would be. Fear of failure, for example, predisposes a man not to attempt any venture that carries a risk. As a consequence, he is apt to allow all things to pass him by, deterred from taking action because of the nature of the images in his mind. Usually, these images are placed there by fear, or one of fear's cousins, and these negative emotional qualities spring out of the subconscious and have been placed there by the ego. The individual may rid himself of them by achieving a proper relationship between the ego and universal mind. He may become whole by getting rid of his sense of surface self, by immersing the ego in his wider being and becoming one with all things and all people. Getting rid of mental blocks. A man is not able to force himself to think different thoughts from those that he habitually thinks. He cannot exclude certain thoughts from his mind or force others to enter by an effort of will. Thought originates in the deeper recesses of his being, an area that largely is unavailable to his conscious mind, and one that will not respond to coercion. A psychological transformation is not possible without a spiritual awakening, and before a man can change his kind and type of thinking, it first is necessary that he alter his conception of self. A little reflection on the ego reveals what a delusional trap it is, for it is primarily a sense of separateness, and it feeds upon a sense of comparison. It is pleased to be better than others, extremely sad to be worse, and it performs all actions for selfish motives, avarice, applause, power. The greatest sickness in the world is to be satisfied in the ego, for then we are blinded to the real nature of life and our potentiality. Only when we are dissatisfied in the ego, through defeat or disillusionment, we are close to the veil that separates us from our true selves. It is at this moment that we suddenly may see, that our eyes and souls may open and penetrate into the deeper and wider being that gives a universal quality to all people. We immensely improve our ability to visualize when we rid ourselves of the mental blocks and prompters that are stored in our subconscious. These we are able to clear away through a proper psychic balance between the ego and the secret self. And we achieve this balance by surrendering ego and turning our lives over to the divine. This is not nearly so difficult as it sounds. We are not responsible for our existence in the first place. We didn't choose the bodies we inhabit, or the life into which we were born, our language, customs, education. Even the people we know have been chosen for us by a greater power. When we learn to trust this power completely, to turn over to it our sense of self, our actions, our mind, our ability, our talent, we are enlarged by it because of that very act. It uses us for its purpose, and many times more effectively than we could ever use ourselves. There is tremendous energy to be gained by surrender of the ego to the secret self. A man becomes a power doubled. He suddenly seems free of restriction, cleared of restraint, his health, energy and resources. No limits. Letting go. Terry was a brilliant youngster. He had a straight A average in high school and was awarded a scholarship at a leading Western university. But he was an intensely nervous and high-strung young man, was afraid of heights, was sick a good deal of the time. Even though he was graduated from college with honours, he nevertheless had great difficulty in finding a job. So unfavourable was the impression that he made upon prospective employers. His record prevailed, however, and he eventually found employment in the laboratory of a large industrial firm. Then, for no apparent reason, he suffered a nervous breakdown and was confined to a sanatorium. Some months later he left the sanatorium, but he was too distracted to readjust to life, and he was directed by a friend to a religious retreat. The retreat house stood on the bluffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean, and on a clear day 100 miles of the California coastline could be seen. The brown hump of Santa Catalina Island stood offshore like a camel rising from the sea. Terry sat for hours on a stone bench, gazing out over this panorama. The magnificence of nature dwarfed him, and he could feel his ego subside. During such a mood, his advisor came to him and they sat and talked. "I see you are better now," the advisor said. "It stands in your eyes. You are not so concerned with yourself." "That's true," answered Terry. "It's because it's so peaceful here." "It is peaceful anywhere, my son, if your soul is properly centered." "How does one properly center his soul?" "By getting rid of self-consciousness." "That's very difficult to do when one has an inferiority complex." "An inferiority complex is a delusion." "It may seem a delusion to you," answered Terry, "but it is not a delusion to me. I am fearful and apprehensive in all I do because I feel inferior, because I am afraid I will not do well." "Then get rid of the sense of yourself as doer. Accept yourself only as instrument. Make up your mind that a power greater than you is working through you to accomplish its ends. It is not embarrassed or fearful or apprehensive. It is dynamic, irresistible and eternal. If you can manage to put yourself in its hands completely, you never will be embarrassed or fearful again, and you will accomplish such things as you never thought possible." Terry listened to his advisor well. In the days that followed, he gazed out upon the sea and sky, and the truth came to him. When he left the retreat and returned to his home, his illness was gone, and he experienced a vigour in mind and body that he had never known. Today, he heeds his own research company. He is well-to-do and respected, and has not had a sick day in years. He credits everything to his religious awakening. "I always thought that I was the one who was carrying the ball," he says, "and the responsibility frightened me. Once I learned that the world and its events and my life were in safer hands than mine, I was able to get myself out of the way and see the working of a master intelligence everywhere. The things I seem to have accomplished have been accomplished by something outside of me. It works through me, just as it will work through you." All I do is let it. The perfect leader. To free the mind of the restrictions imposed by egoistic thinking is the first thing to be done. This is accomplished by turning your life over to the secret self. Place your hopes, your dreams, your ambitions, your talents, your very self on a mental silver platter. Hand it over to the secret self and say, "Here, you take it. You run it. I will listen, follow your advice, execute your will." If you take this mental stand without reservation, your life will be changed forthwith, and you will have embarked upon the highest adventure possible. Moreover, from that time on, the images in your mind will manifest in the world exactly as you visualize them. People who have never experienced a centering of the self outside the ego believe that when they make the declaration that they no longer will take action as a result of egoistic choice, henceforth they will sit like lumps on a log because there will be nothing to stir them once they have surrendered volition. How wrong they are! We never move ourselves into action anyway. All our lives we are moved into action by the secret self. Our difficulties are all caused by the fact that we have a delusional sense of self which clutters up the subconscious with negative emotions, causes restrictive pictures of limitation, lack and fear to be projected into the creative screen of mind, and therefore restricts the amount of energy that can flow through us. The ego is an impediment in the natural dynamic of being. Yet even when present in all its full distortion, the individual is still directed by the secret self, with his power filtered and ineffectual. The man who has been cleared sits like no lump on a log. More likely he thunders across the human scene. Such is the power that manifests through him. Yet he himself does nothing. The power uses him to manifest through, and he simply hitches a ride, acting in the midst of conflict, serenely and surely, as an instrument of power that has everything under control. The power of thought. Once a psychological balance has been obtained, it is startling how clear images become in our mind. It is as if the inner world takes on even more reality than the outer, more dimension, more possibilities, for through our new psychic perception, we become aware that there is the same consciousness in all things. When we visualize something in our minds, we thereby sense the manner in which we affect the physical world. We see that consciousness affected in us affects consciousness in the thing visualized. We become aware that it is impossible for anything to externalize in our world without first being pictured in our minds. The simplest of actions takes on new significance. We cannot reach for a pen, get up and walk to the door, answer the telephone, without first having a mental picture of such acts. We become cognizant of this sequence as the natural cause and effect of all things, and we become exquisitely aware of the fact that we can, by an act of mental visualization, cease responding to stimuli from the sensual world. We become enlightened and disciplined beings, free from bondage to the world of senses. The process by which thoughts become things is rooted in the one intelligence from which all things are made. Everything is conscious, has a form that is determined by the awareness entrapped within. When the idea of a thing is changed within the one supreme consciousness, then the thing itself changes. Spiritual awakening allows a man to visualize clearly, but even before that awakening, he can discipline himself to exercise faith and belief in the things he desires. Jesus, who was certainly one of the great mental teachers, stated that it is done unto us as we believe. He repeatedly illustrated by deed and parable that the answers to our dreams come when we first have accepted their reality in our minds. The man who achieves a dynamic success in life has mastered the art of acting as if it were impossible to fail. Nothing is impossible to anyone if he is capable of envisioning it in his mind, clearly, without reservation. Universal subconscious mind is a doer of all things, and it responds to the conceptions that we project into it with our conscious minds. Visualizing the object. There is no object too important or too trivial for universal mind to manifest it just exactly as it is visualized. But the truth is that few people take the trouble or time to visualize the things they want. They let such matters be decided for them by the events they encounter in the world. If, for example, they meet a friend who has acquired a new car, they are likely to avow to themselves and to family that what they want most of all is a new car. Next day, however, this desire fades, for now an associate in business has been promoted into a new job, and they see that it is this they want most of all, not the new car. Next day, it is something else. The day after, something again. The desire of a week ago is long forgotten unless some event occurs to inspire in them the same reaction. Such people project a constant parade of changing pictures into the subconscious, which moves this way and that and never gets anything done at all. Since they really do not know what it is that they want, it is a small wonder that they achieve nothing. It takes mental discipline to want something and to stay with it, to understand that all things are gained by sacrifice and that nothing is free, easy, or simple. When we look upon the man of prominence and wealth, it appears to us that he had been favoured by nature, gifted more in mind and body and with material things. But if we have had a little spiritual awakening, we arrive at an insight that allows us to see behind all successful men the years of unremitting toil, sweat and tears that have disciplined them into the effective human beings they have become. An inspiring youth, focused in ego and personal concern, has as little connection with a successful man as does an acorn with an oak. 1,000 egoistic selves has paraded across the successful man's consciousness in the years of growth. In a manner, he is all of them. In another, none. In all things, he relies upon a power outside of himself. Affirmation. Visualize we must, and what we visualize manifests in our lives. If we would change our lives, the tool with which to change them is imagination. We must learn to visualize at the behest of a conscious mental choice, and we must teach ourselves to envisage all things clearly and concretely. An effective way to accomplish this is to set aside a period of affirmation each day, and the most beneficial time is just before going to sleep. Then the image is able to settle down into the subconscious without the distraction that results from activity. When we affirm our mental image, we have to know what it is we wish to achieve, whether it is success or health, improvements in personality, greater happiness, whatever. And we have to clearly conceive ourselves as possessing it. Be sure that it is something that is right for you, something that you are willing to devote time and effort to obtain. The important things are a clear conception and a willingness to make all necessary sacrifices to effect it. The picture we form in our minds should be so clear we can almost touch it, and it should be projected with feeling. Affirm this image verbally. Write out a short and clear affirmation and be able to repeat it to yourselves as you visualize your objective. Consciously relax your mind and body when you go through this affirmation period. Get the feeling that you are not making something happen, only accepting it. Feel that this thing is real in your mind, where all true cause exists. Finish your affirmation with a feeling of faith and expectancy and serenity. Know that your image will manifest in the world just as surely as you keep it sharp and clear in your mind. During the day, think and feel and act as if your desire were already manifested. You will then behave as if you have it, and this complete change in your psychic position will attract the situation to you. It is a wonderful thing to experience the power of mind over matter. Once you have been able to bring some desired circumstance into your life by an act of faith and visualization, you will never again feel alone and friendless and helpless. Will know that you have within yourself the key to all creation. Abundance and happiness and success and achievement are unlimited. The power to provide all exists in your mind and your imagination.